Margaret Holloway pressed her palm against the cold window of the taxi, watching Chicago's skyline blur through the December snow. 53 years old, and she felt like a woman who had just been pushed off a cliff with no warning. 3 days ago, Richard had handed her the papers during breakfast, between sips of coffee, as if he were passing the salt. 30 years of marriage, one sentence. "I've met someone else." The words still echoed in her chest like a wound that refused to close. The taxi pulled up to the Langham Hotel, where her company's annual Christmas gala was already in full swing. She could hear the muffled sound of an orchestra through the gilded doors, see the warm glow of chandeliers reflected on the snow-covered sidewalk. Margaret smoothed her emerald dress, the one she had bought for this night before everything fell apart. She had considered staying home, burying herself under blankets and pretending the world did not exist. But her boss had called twice, reminding her that the partners expected her presence. Inside, the ballroom sparkled like a dream from another lifetime. Crystal ornaments hung from towering Christmas trees, their branches laden with silver ribbons and white lights. Women in sequined gowns laughed near the champagne fountain, while men in tailored suits exchanged business cards and hollow pleasantries. Margaret moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting a glass of wine she knew she would not finish, smiling at colleagues, whose names she could barely remember. She found a seat near the edge of the room, close to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. The city lights twinkled below, indifferent to her pain. She thought about Daniel, her only son, the boy she had raised with every ounce of love she possessed. He had left Chicago 12 years ago, shortly after his 21st birthday, saying he needed to find himself. He called once a month, always brief, always vague. She had learned not to ask too many questions, though the silence between them had grown into something vast and unspoken. A woman approached, one of the junior associates whose name Margaret could not recall. "Mrs. Holloway, you look stunning tonight," she said with practiced cheerfulness. "Is your husband here?" The question landed like a slap. Margaret forced a smile, the kind she had perfected over decades of corporate events. "He couldn't make it. Work obligations." The associate nodded sympathetically before disappearing back into the crowd. Margaret set down her wineglass and excused herself, walking toward the restroom with measured steps. She needed a moment alone, somewhere she could breathe without witnesses. The hallway leading to the restrooms was quieter, the sounds of the party muffled by heavy curtains and thick carpet. She passed a set of double doors that led to a private conference area, noticing they were slightly ajar. Male voices drifted through the gap, low and serious, speaking in tones that made her pause. "The shipment arrives at midnight. Make sure the warehouse is secure." "And the Castellanos? They've been asking questions." "Let them ask. We own the Port Authority. They can't move without our permission." Margaret's heart stuttered. She recognized that voice. She had heard it grow from a child's whisper to a young man's confidence. It was Daniel. Her hands trembled as she pressed closer to the door, peering through the narrow opening. Her son stood at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by men in expensive suits. His posture had changed from the awkward boy she remembered into something commanding, something dangerous. His eyes, once soft and curious, now carried a weight she did not recognize. "Tell Moretti we'll handle the situation," Daniel said, his voice calm and cold. "No loose ends." One of the men nodded. "And the woman who saw the exchange last week?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "She's been relocated. She won't be a problem." Margaret stumbled backward, her heels catching on the carpet. The sound was small, barely a whisper, but Daniel's head snapped toward the door. Their eyes met through the gap, and for a single, terrible moment, time stopped. "Mom?" The word shattered something inside her. She turned and ran, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she fled toward the ballroom. The party noise crashed over her like a wave, faces blurring into a kaleidoscope of colors and sounds. She heard footsteps behind her, heard Daniel calling her name, but she could not stop. She pushed through the crowd, ignoring the startled looks and concerned questions, until she burst through the hotel's front doors into the freezing December night. The snow fell heavily now, coating the sidewalk in white silence. Margaret's breath came in ragged gasps, her chest burning from cold and something far more devastating. Everything she thought she knew about her son, about her life, had just collapsed into ruins. "Mom, wait." Daniel caught up to her near the street corner, his coat thrown hastily over his shoulders. He looked younger in the snow, vulnerable in a way that reminded her of the boy who used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking, "what have you become?" He stood before her, snow catching in his dark hair, his expression torn between the son she loved and the stranger she had just witnessed. "I can explain. Please, just let me explain." Tears streamed down, her face mixing with the snowflakes that clung to her cheeks. "Explain what? That my son is a criminal? That everything I believed about you was a lie?" "Not everything." He stepped closer, his voice softening. "I'm still your son. I'm still the boy who used to help you bake cookies and watch old movies on Sunday afternoons. That hasn't changed." "How can you say that?" She shook her head, backing away. "I heard what you said in there. Shipments, problems, loose ends. Do you have any idea what those words mean?" Daniel's face hardened, then crumbled. "I know exactly what they mean, and I know you deserve better than this. But I can't undo the choices I've made, Mum. I can only try to protect you from them." A black SUV pulled up to the curb, its windows tinted, its engine humming with quiet menace. Two men stepped out, their eyes scanning the street with professional alertness. Daniel raised a hand, signaling them to wait. "Come with me," he said gently. "It's not safe for you to be alone right now, please." Margaret stared at the vehicle, at the men who moved like shadows, at the son she no longer recognized. Her entire world had shattered in the space of 5 minutes, and she had no idea how to piece it together. "Where are you taking me?" "Somewhere safe. Somewhere we can talk without anyone listening." She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run. But beneath the fear, beneath the shock, there was something else. A mother's love that refused to abandon her child, even when that child had become a stranger. She nodded slowly and allowed Daniel to guide her toward the waiting vehicle. The city lights blurred past as they drove through the snowy streets, and Margaret watched Chicago transform from a place of painful memories into an unknown territory she was only beginning to understand. The SUV carried them through downtown, past the glittering towers of the Magnificent Mile, and into neighborhoods she had never visited. The buildings grew older, their facades marked by time and weather, until they reached a residential area on the city's western edge. The vehicle turned into a gated compound surrounded by high walls and security cameras, coming to a stop before a Victorian mansion that seemed out of place in the modern landscape. "This is where you live?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's one of my properties," Daniel replied. "The safest one." Inside, the mansion was warm and elegant, filled with dark wood, furniture and art that spoke of old money and quiet power. A fire crackled in the main living room, casting dancing shadows across Persian rugs and leather armchairs. Daniel guided his mother to a seat near the hearth, then dismissed the men who had accompanied them with a subtle nod. "Tell me everything," Margaret said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I need to understand how this happened." Daniel sat across from her, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the flames. "When I left Chicago 12 years ago, I was lost. Dad had just told me I wasn't good enough to join his firm, that I needed to prove myself somewhere else. I was angry, hurt. I wanted to show him I could succeed without his help." Margaret's throat tightened. She remembered those arguments, remembered Richard's harsh words and Daniel's wounded silence. She had tried to mediate, to smooth the tension, but father and son had been too proud to listen. "I went to New York first," Daniel continued. "Tried to make it in finance just like Dad wanted, but I failed. Lost everything within 2 years. I was living in a cramped apartment, barely able to afford food, when I met a man named Salvatore Ricci." The name meant nothing to Margaret, but the way Daniel spoke it suggested a significance she could not yet grasp. "Salvatore saw something in me. He offered me a job, said I had the kind of mind that could solve problems others couldn't see. I didn't ask questions. I was desperate. Daniel paused, running a hand through his hair. By the time I understood what I had become part of, it was too late to walk away. So you became a criminal, Margaret said flatly. Just like that. It wasn't that simple. Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain she recognized from his childhood. I made choices, some of them wrong, some of them necessary. I climbed the ranks because I was good at strategy, at seeing patterns. When Salvatore died 5 years ago, I inherited his network, his responsibilities. His empire, Margaret corrected. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, his empire. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Margaret stared at her son, trying to reconcile the boy she had nursed through fevers and homework with the man who commanded dangerous men and darker operations. "And Richard?" she asked suddenly. "Did he know?" Daniel's expression shifted, something cold flickering behind his eyes. "Dad knows nothing. He's too busy with his new life to care about what I've become." The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. Margaret thought about the divorce papers sitting on her kitchen counter, about Richard's casual cruelty, and felt a strange alignment with her son's anger. "Your father is a fool," she said quietly. "He always valued status over people. I should have seen it sooner." Daniel reached across and took her hand. His grip was warm, steady, nothing like the cold voice she had heard in the conference room. "You didn't deserve what he did to you, Mom, none of it. And I promise you this, no matter what I've become, I will never let anyone hurt you again." Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If stories that touch your heart matter to you, if you want to feel something real every time you press play, then this is where you belong. Subscribe now so you never miss a moment that could change the way you see the world. The morning after the Christmas party, Margaret woke in an unfamiliar bedroom, surrounded by silk curtains and antique furniture that seemed to belong to another century. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the memories crashed over her like a winter tide. Richard's betrayal, the gala, Daniel's voice in that conference room. She rose slowly, her body aching from restless sleep, and found a robe draped over a chair near the window. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving Chicago blanketed in pristine white. The compound's gardens stretched below, bare trees standing like sentinels against the grey December sky. A knock at the door made her turn. "Come in." Daniel entered carrying a tray with coffee, fruit, and pastries. He looked different in the morning light, softer somehow, though the shadows beneath his eyes suggested he had slept even less than she had. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the tray on a small table near the fireplace. "I wasn't sure what you liked anymore." Margaret accepted the coffee, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "You remembered how I take it, black with 1 sugar. Some things don't change." He sat in the chair across from her, watching her with an expression that mixed concern with something more guarded. "How are you feeling?" "Honestly, I don't know." She took a sip, letting the warmth spread through her chest. "Everything I thought I knew about my life has collapsed in 3 days. My husband left me for another woman. My son is—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "A man you don't recognize," Daniel completed gently. "I understand." "Do you?" Margaret set down the cup, her voice sharpening. "Do you understand what it's like to discover your only child has become someone you never imagined? I raised you to be kind, Daniel. I taught you that integrity mattered more than success. And now I find out you've built a criminal operation that spans entire states." Daniel did not flinch. "Everything you taught me still matters. It's why I've tried to run things differently than Salvatore did. We don't deal in drugs, we don't traffic people. The operations I oversee are focused on logistics, finance, real estate, things that exist in a grey area, not in darkness." "A grey area," Margaret laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call it when men in expensive suits talk about eliminating problems?" "That woman we discussed last night," Daniel said carefully, "she was a witness to a transaction that could have exposed dozens of people to prosecution. We didn't hurt her, Mum. We relocated her to a safe place with a new identity, and enough money to start over. She's living in Vermont now, running a bookshop. I made sure of it personally." Margaret stared at him, searching for the lie in his words. She found none. "You expect me to believe that everything you do is somehow noble?" "No." Daniel leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I'm not noble. I've made decisions that keep me awake at night. I've ordered actions that I can never undo. But I've also built something that protects the people who work for me, that provides for families who would otherwise have nothing. The world isn't black and white, Mum. It's endless shades of grey, and I've learned to navigate them." Before Margaret could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach clench. "Richard." "He's calling," she said flatly. "Probably wants to discuss the house." Daniel's expression darkened. "Don't answer. I have to deal with this eventually. Not today. Not while you're still processing everything." He stood, pacing toward the window. "Let me help you with the divorce. I have lawyers who can handle it cleanly. Make sure you get everything you deserve." Margaret felt a strange mixture of gratitude and discomfort. "I don't want your money, Daniel, or your lawyers. It's not about money. It's about making sure Dad can't walk away from 30 years of marriage with nothing but a signature." Daniel turned back to her, his jaw set. "He humiliated you. He discarded you like you meant nothing. That's not something I can forgive." "Forgiveness isn't yours to give or withhold." Margaret rose, crossing the room to stand beside him at the window. "Richard made his choice. I'm angry, yes. Heartbroken, absolutely. But I won't let his betrayal turn me into someone bitter." Daniel studied her face, something shifting behind his eyes. "You're stronger than I remembered." "I've had to be." She placed a hand on his arm. "When you left, I spent years wondering what I did wrong, whether I failed you somehow. Now I understand that you were running from your father's expectations, not from me. But Daniel, you can't keep running forever. I'm not running anymore." His voice was quiet but firm. "I'm standing, building, protecting what matters. And what matters to you." He met her gaze directly. "You, Mum. You've always mattered most." The words settled between them like snow on a still night. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back. She had spent so many years feeling disconnected from her son, wondering if he thought of her at all. To hear him say those words, even in the midst of everything else, cracked something open inside her. "I want to understand your world," she said slowly. "Not accept it, not yet, but understand it. Can you show me?" Daniel hesitated. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure that I can't make any decisions until I know what I'm dealing with. You're my son. Whatever else you've become, that hasn't changed." He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Then let me show you." The next several hours became a kind of tour Margaret could never have imagined. Daniel drove her through Chicago in a modest sedan, deliberately choosing a vehicle that would not attract attention. He showed her the legitimate businesses he owned, a chain of restaurants in the Loop, a construction company that employed hundreds of workers, a shipping logistics firm that operated along the entire Great Lakes region. "These aren't fronts," he explained as they stood outside a bustling Italian restaurant on Taylor Street. "They're real operations that make real money. I invested in them because I wanted something concrete, something that would survive no matter what happened to the other parts of my organization." Margaret watched the lunch crowd through the window, families and couples enjoying pasta and wine, completely unaware of who owned the establishment. "And the other parts? The ones that aren't so legitimate?" Daniel guided her back to the car. "Those exist too. I won't pretend otherwise. But I've spent years minimizing them, transitioning resources into legal channels. It's slow work, and not everyone in my network agrees with the direction. But it's the path I've chosen." "Why?" Margaret asked as they drove toward the lakefront. "Why try to go legitimate when you could keep things as they are?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Because I don't want to end up like Salvatore. He died, alone, surrounded by enemies, with no one to mourn him except men who were already planning to divide his territory. I want something different. I want a life that means more than power. They parked near Oak Street Beach, the winter waves crashing against the frozen shore. Margaret pulled her coat tighter, stepping out into the cold air. The city stretched behind them, glass towers reflecting the pale sunlight. "I've missed you," she said quietly. "All these years, I told myself you were finding your path, that you'd come back when you were ready. I never imagined this was what you were building. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you." Daniel stood beside her, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I was afraid of how you'd react, afraid you'd stop loving me." Margaret turned to face him, her eyes glistening. "Daniel, nothing you could do would ever make me stop loving you. You're my child. That bond doesn't break, no matter what." He looked away, but not before she saw the moisture gathering in his own eyes. "I don't deserve that." "Love isn't about deserving." She reached up and touched his cheek, the gesture so familiar yet so weighted now. "It's about choosing someone every day, even when they disappoint you, even when they become someone you don't recognize." "I choose you, Daniel, I always have." They stood in silence, mother and son, watching the waves roll in as the cold wind swept across the beach. For the first time since the Christmas party, Margaret felt something other than despair, a fragile hope that perhaps not everything was lost. That evening, Daniel introduced her to someone unexpected. Her name was Elena, a woman in her early 30s with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She worked as a financial analyst for one of Daniel's legitimate companies, but clearly occupied a position of greater importance. "Elena has been with me for 4 years, Daniel explained as they sat down to dinner in the mansion's formal dining room. "She manages the transition strategy, making sure our legitimate businesses grow strong enough to eventually stand alone." Elena smiled warmly at Margaret. "Your son is a visionary, Mrs. Holloway. Most men in his position would never consider leaving the old ways behind. Daniel is different. He sees a future where this family can operate entirely in the light." "Family?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. Daniel and Elena exchanged a glance that communicated volumes. "We've been together for 2 years, Daniel admitted. "I wanted to tell you, but the timing never seemed right." Margaret absorbed this information, adding it to the growing pile of revelations. "You're in love." "Yes." Eleanor reached across and took Daniel's hand. "And we're expecting a child. I'm 3 months along." The announcement hit Margaret like a wave. She was going to be a grandmother. Her son, the man she had spent years worrying about, was building a family of his own. "I don't know what to say," Margaret whispered, tears finally breaking free. "I thought I lost you, Daniel. I thought you were gone forever, living some mysterious life I could never understand. And now you know everything," Daniel finished. "The good, the bad, all of it. And I'm asking you to be part of our lives, Mom, not just as a visitor, but as family. Real family." Margaret looked between her son and the woman who clearly loved him, seeing something she had not expected to find in this dark world. Genuine happiness. "I need time," she said honestly, "to process everything, to understand what accepting this invitation really means." "Take all the time you need," Elena said gently. "We're not going anywhere." The days between Christmas and New Year passed in a strange rhythm of discovery and reflection. Margaret remained at Daniel's compound, gradually learning the contours of his world. She met his most trusted associates, men and women whose loyalty had been earned through years of mutual respect. She observed the careful way he managed operations, the boundaries he enforced, the lines he refused to cross. She also watched Elena, noting the way the younger woman carried herself with quiet confidence. Elena had grown up in poverty, working her way through college on scholarships and determination. She had no illusions about Daniel's past, but she believed fiercely in his future. "He saved my brother's life," Elena confided one afternoon as they walked through the mansion's greenhouse. 3 years ago, Marco got involved with dangerous people. He owed them more money than he could ever repay. They were going to hurt him, maybe worse. Daniel intervened, paid the debt, gave Marco a job at one of his construction sites. And in return, Elena smiled. In return, Marco works hard and stays out of trouble. Daniel didn't ask for anything else. That's when I knew he was different from the others. Margaret touched the leaves of a poinsettia, its red petals vibrant, against the winter grey outside. Do you worry about the future? About what might happen? Every day. Eleanor's expression sobered. But I've learned that worry doesn't change anything. Action does. Daniel is building something new, and I'm going to help him finish it. On New Year's Eve, Daniel hosted a small gathering at the mansion. Unlike the corporate gala, where everything had unraveled, this event was intimate. Only a dozen people, all of them connected to his inner circle. Margaret found herself seated beside a man named Vincent, Daniel's oldest friend and current head of security. You raised a good man, Mrs. Holloway, Vincent said, his gravelly voice softened by sincerity. I've seen leaders come and go in this world. Most of them care only about power. Daniel cares about people, about doing right by them. He's still involved in criminal activity, Margaret pointed out quietly. Less every year. Vincent shrugged. The old ways are dying. The smart ones adapt. Daniel's not. Just adapting, he's transforming. Give him another decade and the Holloway name will be as clean as any in Chicago. Margaret considered his words as midnight approached. She thought about Richard, about the 30 years she had invested in a marriage that had meant nothing to him. She thought about the life she had built on foundations that turned out to be sand. And she thought about her son, who had constructed something entirely different. A world of shadows and light, danger and protection, where love was both the prize and the guiding force. As the clock struck 12, glasses were raised and cheers echoed through the grand hall. Daniel found his way to Margaret's side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Happy New Year, Mom. Happy New Year, Daniel. She leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his presence. I've been thinking. About? About staying. About being part of this family you're building. Daniel pulled back slightly, searching her face. Are you serious? I'm serious about wanting to understand, about being here for you and Elena and my grandchild. She paused, her voice catching. I spent years feeling alone, Daniel. Even when I was married, even when I was surrounded by colleagues and friends. I don't want to feel that way anymore. You won't. He held her gaze with an intensity that reminded her of the boy he had once been. I promise you won't. If you're feeling something right now, something stirring in your chest that you can't quite name, then you understand why this story matters. Leave a comment saying, I choose love over fear. Let the world know that you believe in second chances, in family, in the power of starting over. The first week of January brought an unexpected complication. Margaret woke to find Daniel in urgent conversation with Vincent in the study, their voices tense and clipped. What's happening? She asked from the doorway. Daniel looked up, his expression guarded. Someone's been asking questions. About me, about my operations. Someone connected to law enforcement. Margaret's stomach tightened. Are you in danger? Not yet. But we need to be careful. He crossed to her, lowering his voice. I'm going to increase security around the compound. I don't want you going anywhere without an escort. Daniel, I'm not going to live as a prisoner. Not a prisoner, protected. He gripped her shoulders gently. There are people who would hurt you just to get to me. I won't let that happen. Over. The following days, Margaret observed the heightened vigilance that descended over the household. Additional guards appeared at the gates, and electronic surveillance was upgraded throughout the property. Eleanor moved about with practiced calm, but Margaret could see the worry beneath her composure. Then, on a cold January afternoon, Margaret received a visitor she had not expected. Richard arrived at the compound gates, demanding to see her. Daniel wanted to turn him away, but Margaret insisted. He's still my husband legally. I need to face him eventually. They met in the mansion's library, a room lined with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a massive stone fireplace. Richard looked older than she remembered, his face drawn with something that might have been stress or guilt. Margaret. He stood awkwardly near the entrance, clearly uncomfortable with the opulent surroundings. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. I've been occupied. With what? With whom? His gaze swept the room, taking in the expensive furnishings. Where are you staying? Who owns this place? That's not your concern anymore. Margaret kept her voice steady. You lost the right to ask about my life when you handed me divorce papers over breakfast. Richard flinched but pressed on. I made a mistake. Karen and it didn't work out. She left me 2 days ago. Margaret felt nothing at this revelation. No satisfaction, no anger, just a hollow echo where emotion should have been. And you thought you could come here and what? Take me back? I thought we could talk, figure things out. There's nothing to figure out. She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. You discarded me like I was nothing. You humiliated me after 30 years of partnership. Did you think I would just wait around hoping you'd change your mind? I know I hurt you. I know I was wrong. Yes, you were. Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her. But I've learned something these past few weeks. I've learned that the life I was living wasn't really a life at all. It was a performance, a role I played, because I didn't know there was anything else. What are you talking about? I'm talking about family, Richard. Real family. The kind that shows up when everything falls apart, that doesn't abandon you when things get difficult. Richard's eyes narrowed. Is this about Daniel? You're with Daniel? I'm with my son, yes. The son you pushed away because he didn't meet your impossible standards. He's a criminal, Margaret. Richard's voice rose. I've heard rumors, dangerous rumors. If you stay here, you're putting yourself at risk. That's my choice to make. She moved toward the door, signaling the conversation was over. The divorce will proceed as planned. My lawyers will be in touch. You're making a mistake. Margaret paused at the threshold, looking back at the man she had once loved. The mistake was thinking I needed you to be complete. I don't. I never did. She left him, standing alone in the library, and walked back toward the warmth of her new life. February arrived with a brutal cold snap that locked Chicago in ice for nearly 2 weeks. Margaret found herself adapting to the rhythm of the compound, rising early to join Elena for breakfast, spending afternoons reading in the library, and evenings learning about Daniel's operations in greater detail. She discovered that his legitimate enterprises employed over 1,000 people across the region, providing stable jobs and benefits to families who might otherwise struggle. The construction company had won contracts to rebuild affordable housing in underserved neighborhoods. The restaurant chain partnered with local farms, supporting small agricultural businesses. These were not the actions of a man consumed by greed. They were the careful investments of someone trying to build something lasting. But the shadow operations remained. Margaret could not ignore them, could not pretend they did not exist. She saw the encrypted phones, the late-night meetings, the careful way Daniel spoke around certain topics. Whatever he was planning, it involved risks that extended beyond business. One evening, after a particularly tense day, Daniel invited her to his private office, a secure room on the mansion's 3rd floor. Inside, the walls were covered with maps, charts, and photographs. A digital screen displayed financial data that scrolled continuously. I want to show you something, Daniel said, closing the door behind them. Something I've never shown anyone outside my inner circle. He activated the screen, bringing up a series of files. 5 years ago, when I took over from Salvatore, this organization was involved in dozens of illegal activities. Human trafficking, drug distribution, weapons smuggling. I've spent every year since then dismantling those operations, redirecting resources into legitimate channels. Margaret studied the data, seeing the decline in illegal revenue, matched by growth in legal profits. This is impressive, Daniel, but it's not complete. No, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. There's one operation I haven't been able to close, a partnership that was established before I took over, with people who don't accept retirement as an option. Who? The Castellanos, an old family with roots in the city going back generations. They control ports, unions, political connections, Salvatore allied with them decades ago, and they consider that alliance permanent. Margaret remembered the name from the Christmas party, the conversation she had overheard. They're the ones asking questions. They're asking because they know I want out. Daniel's jaw tightened. I've been negotiating for months trying to find a buyout that satisfies them, but they don't want money, they want influence, control. What happens if you can't reach an agreement? Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then things get complicated. Margaret felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the winter cold. Daniel, I need to ask you something directly. Have people been hurt because of your orders? He met her gaze without flinching. I've given orders that resulted in harm to people who threatened my organization. I won't pretend otherwise, but I've never ordered action against innocents, never against people who weren't already part of this world by their own choice. That's a distinction that might matter to you, but does it matter to the law? The law sees everything in absolutes. I've learned to operate in spaces where absolutes don't exist. He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his face. Does knowing this change how you see me? Margaret considered the question carefully. It changes my understanding of what you've faced, what you've had to become to survive in this world, but it doesn't change how I feel about you as my son. How can you say that? Because I'm your mother. She stepped closer, placing her hand on his chest where his heart beat steadily beneath expensive fabric. I've loved you from the moment I knew you existed, through every disappointment, every silence, every year you were gone. That love doesn't come with conditions. Daniel closed his eyes and Margaret saw moisture gather at the corners. I don't deserve you. Maybe not, she smiled gently, but you're stuck with me anyway. The tension between Daniel and the Castellanos escalated throughout February. Margaret became aware of increased security measures, of meetings that ran late into the night, of the worried looks Elena tried to hide. Something was building toward confrontation, and she could not shake the feeling that it would arrive sooner than anyone expected. On the last day of the month, Vincent appeared at her door with an expression that made her blood run cold. Mrs. Holloway, I need you to come with me. Now. What's happening? There's been an incident. Daniel needs to see you. She followed him. Through the mansion's corridors, her heart pounding with each step. They descended to the lower level, to a part of the compound she had never visited. Vincent guided her through a reinforced door into what appeared to be a medical facility. Sterile white walls, gleaming equipment, the sharp scent of antiseptic. Daniel sat on an examination table, his shirt removed, revealing a wound on his left shoulder that was being tended by a woman in medical scrubs. Blood stained the fabric bunched at his waist. Daniel! Margaret rushed to his side. What happened? A warning shot that got a little too close. His voice was tight with pain, but his eyes remained focused. The Castellanos made their position clear tonight. They attacked you? A demonstration. They wanted me to know they could reach me whenever they chose. He winced as the medic applied pressure to the wound. It's not serious, just a graze. Margaret felt fury rise in her chest, hot and unexpected. This is unacceptable. These people think they can just shoot at my son and walk away? Mom, please. Daniel reached for her hand with his uninjured arm. This is how things work in my world. Messages are sent and received. Negotiations continue. To hell with negotiations. She heard her own voice shake with anger. They could have ended your life tonight. They could have taken you from Elena, from your child, from me. But they didn't. That's the point. He squeezed her fingers. They want to pressure me into concessions. If they wanted me gone, I wouldn't be here talking to you. The logic did nothing to calm her fear. Margaret stayed at his side as the medic finished treating the wound, watching her son endure pain with a stoicism that both impressed and disturbed her. When they were finally alone, she asked the question that had been burning in her mind. What are you going to do? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I'm going to end this, one way or another. What does that mean? It means I've been patient long enough. His eyes hardened into something she did not recognize. The Castellanos think they hold all the power because they've been in this city longer, because they have connections I don't. But they're wrong. I've spent 5 years building something stronger, and it's time to use it. March arrived with a deceptive mildness, the temperatures rising just enough to melt the worst of the ice while leaving the city suspended between winter and spring. Margaret watched the preparations unfold around her, with a mixture of dread and reluctant fascination. Daniel operated with cold precision, coordinating meetings and movements that she could only partially glimpse. She learned that he had allies she had never suspected. Federal contacts who were willing to look the other way in exchange for intelligence on larger criminal networks, political figures who owed their positions to his quiet support, business leaders who depended on his investments. It's like watching a chess game, Elena observed one evening as they sat together in the greenhouse. Daniel's been positioning pieces for years. The Castellanos just realized they're already surrounded. Will there be violence? Elena's hand moved to her growing stomach, a protective gesture that spoke volumes. Daniel promised me no bloodshed unless absolutely necessary. He wants to dismantle them through exposure, not confrontation. Can that actually work? He's collected evidence on their operations for 3 years. Financial records, witness statements, recorded conversations, enough to bring federal attention that even their political connections can't deflect. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Daniel would leak carefully selected information to journalists and prosecutors, creating pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The Castellanos would be forced to defend themselves on legal battlegrounds where their traditional methods held no power. But Margaret knew enough about the world her son inhabited to understand that plans rarely survived first contact with reality. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening in mid-March. Daniel had arranged a meeting with Marco Castellano, the family's eldest son and de facto leader, at a neutral location, a private club on the Gold Coast where powerful men had resolved disputes for over a century. Margaret learned of the meeting only after Daniel had already left. She spent the hours pacing the mansion's corridors, checking, her phone obsessively, jumping at every sound. Elena joined her, equally anxious, and they sat together in the main living room, waiting. At 11 o'clock, the gates opened, and Daniel's car pulled into the compound. Margaret was at the door before he reached it, searching his face for any sign of injury or distress. "It's done," he said simply. "The Castellanos are finished." Over the following days, the story emerged in fragments. Daniel had presented Marco Castellano with a choice: accept a negotiated withdrawal from all shared operations, or face the release of evidence that would destroy their family's public facade and trigger federal investigations. Marco had initially refused, convinced that Daniel was bluffing. But Daniel had anticipated this, arranging for selected materials to appear simultaneously in the inboxes of 3 major newspaper editors. The articles ran the next morning, detailing decades of corruption, intimidation, and financial manipulation by the Castellano family. Within a week, Marco was under indictment. His brothers fled the country. The empire that had dominated Chicago's underworld for generations collapsed with startling speed. "How did you know they wouldn't retaliate?" Margaret asked when Daniel finally had time to explain. "Because I made sure they had no one left to retaliate with." He sat beside her in the library, his face showing the exhaustion of months of pressure finally released. Their soldiers were already looking for exits. Their political allies were already distancing themselves. By the time the articles hit, the Castellanos were isolated. Attacking me would have only accelerated their fall. "So it's over? Truly over?" "The immediate threat is over." Daniel took her hand. "But there's still work to do. Transitioning the remaining grey operations, strengthening our legitimate businesses, building for the future." "Your child's future," Margaret added. He smiled, a genuine expression that erased years from his face. "Yes, and your future, Mom, if you're willing to stay." Margaret looked around the library, at the leather-bound volumes and the crackling fire, at the home her son had built from shadows and determination. She thought about Richard, alone in his apartment, discovering too late what he had thrown away. She thought about the years of loneliness, the feeling that life was happening somewhere else while she merely observed. "I'm willing," she said. "More than willing." The spring brought changes Margaret could never have predicted. Elena's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and the household began preparations for the arrival of a new generation. Daniel threw himself into expanding the legitimate side of his empire, closing the last remaining questionable operations and hiring teams of lawyers and accountants to ensure everything could withstand scrutiny. Margaret found her own role evolving. Her years of corporate experience proved valuable in ways she had not expected, helping to structure governance for the growing network of businesses. She became a regular presence at board meetings and strategy sessions, offering perspective that balanced Daniel's instincts with practical wisdom. But more than anything, she became family. Real family. The kind she had always craved but never truly experienced. On a warm evening in late May, she sat with Elena on the mansion's terrace, watching the sunset paint Chicago's skyline in shades of gold and rose. "I never imagined my life turning out this way," Margaret confessed. "6 months ago I was a corporate executive married to a man who didn't love me, wondering if anything I did really mattered. And now I'm a grandmother-to-be, helping my son build something that could last for generations." She laughed softly. "It's not the path I would have chosen. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the paths we choose are never as important as the people we find along the way." Eleanor smiled, one hand resting on her stomach, where new life grew. "Daniel talks about you constantly, you know, about how strong you are, how you accepted everything without turning away. He says you're the reason he believes redemption is possible." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I spent years feeling like I failed him, like I should have done something different when he was young, should have protected him from Richard's expectations." "You did protect him." Eleanor reached over and took her hand. "You showed him what unconditional love looks like. That's why he's able to love others now. That's why he's able to imagine a different future." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness settling over the city like a gentle blanket. Somewhere inside the mansion, Daniel was on the phone, managing details and making plans. But out here, in the quiet of the evening, Margaret felt something she had not experienced in decades: peace. Eleanor's daughter was born on a stormy June night, her first cries competing with thunder that rolled across Lake Michigan. They named her Sophia, after Daniel's grandmother, a woman Margaret had never met, but whose memory she had cherished through photographs and stories. Holding her granddaughter for the first time, Margaret felt the world shift on its axis. This tiny person with her dark hair and curious eyes represented everything Daniel had fought to protect, everything he was still fighting to build. "She looks like you," Margaret told Elena, who lay, exhausted but radiant, in the hospital bed. "And she has Daniel's stubbornness, I can already tell." Daniel stood beside the window, watching the storm rage outside while his daughter slept in his mother's arms. "I never thought I'd have this," he said quietly. "A family, a future. People who love me despite knowing everything." "You earned it." Margaret lifted her gaze from Sophia's sleeping face. "Every sacrifice, every difficult decision, every year you spent building something from nothing. This is the result. Is it enough?" There was vulnerability in his voice, a need for reassurance that reminded her of the boy he had once been. "Is it enough to balance everything else?" Margaret considered the question carefully. She thought about the world Daniel had shown her, the complex web of loyalty and power and consequence. She thought about the lives he had protected and the lines he had crossed. She thought about redemption and whether it could ever truly be complete. "Life isn't a ledger," she finally said. "You can't balance good against bad and arrive at a final sum. All you can do is keep making choices, keep trying to be better than you were before. And you've done that, Daniel. You're doing it every day." The summer passed in a blur of new parenthood and business expansion. Daniel formally dissolved the last connections to his former life, negotiating settlements and transfers that freed him from obligations he had never wanted. The Holloway name became associated with philanthropy and investment, with community development and job creation. Old shadows faded as new light emerged. Margaret settled into a role she had never anticipated, matriarch of an unconventional family. She helped Elena navigate the challenges of motherhood while contributing to the strategic direction of Daniel's enterprises. She found purpose in work that mattered, in relationships that sustained her, in a granddaughter who brightened every room she entered. On a crisp October evening, as leaves turned gold across the compound's grounds, Richard appeared once more. He arrived unannounced, his appearance haggard, his eyes carrying a desperation Margaret recognized from her own darkest moments. "I've lost everything," he said when they met in the library. "The firm is gone. Karen took what was left. I have nothing." Margaret studied the man who had once held her heart in careless hands. She felt compassion, but no desire to return to what they had shared. "I'm sorry for your pain, Richard, truly. But you made choices that led here. We all live with our choices." "I was a fool." Tears gathered in his eyes. "I threw away the best thing I ever had because I was too blind to see it." "You're right. You were a fool." Margaret's voice held no anger, only a calm truth. "But that doesn't mean your story is over. You can still build something new. Find meaning in places you never looked before." "How? I'm 62 years old. What can I possibly build?" "That's for you to discover." She rose, signaling the end of their conversation. "But I can't help you find it. My life is here now, with my son, with my granddaughter, with people who value what I bring. I wish you well, Richard, but this is goodbye." He left that evening, disappearing back into a city that no longer held any place for him in her world. Margaret watched his car vanish through the gates and felt the last weight of her old life lift from her shoulders. The first Christmas at the compound. Since everything changed, arrived with fresh snow and the laughter of a growing family. Daniel decorated a tree that reached nearly to the ceiling of the main hall, while Elena organized festivities that included the extended network of people who had become part of their lives. Vincent brought his wife and children. The restaurant staff came with homemade dishes. Even some of Daniel's former associates, now legitimate business partners, joined the celebration. Margaret stood at the edge of the gathering, watching Sophia toddle across the floor in her tiny holiday dress, chasing a ribbon that sparkled in the firelight. Daniel caught his daughter and lifted her high, her giggles filling the room with pure joy. "You did this," Eleanor said, appearing at Margaret's side. "You made him believe it was possible." "I just loved him." Margaret smiled. "The rest was his choice. It's still a miracle. All of it." They watched together as Daniel danced with his daughter, his face alight with a happiness that had seemed impossible only a year before. Around them the party continued, voices and music blending into a symphony of celebration. As midnight approached, Daniel made his way to Margaret's side. He held Sophia in one arm and offered his free hand to his mother. "Dance with me?" She took his hand and let him lead her onto the makeshift dance floor, surrounded by people who had become family in ways both expected and extraordinary. "Thank you," Daniel whispered as they swayed to the music. "For everything, for staying, for believing in me. Thank you for giving me something to believe in." She looked up at her son, seeing not the dangerous man she had glimpsed a year ago, but the person he had always been beneath the armor, her child struggling to find light in darkness, reaching for something better. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, Daniel. Always have, always will." The music played on as snow fell gently outside, coating the compound in pristine white. Inside, warmth and light pushed back against the cold, creating a sanctuary where love had been chosen over fear, where family had been rebuilt from broken pieces, where hope had emerged from the most unlikely soil. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel." Your words mean everything to me, And if this story touched something in your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. New stories are coming. Stories about love and courage and the families we choose. Margaret held her son and granddaughter close as the party swirled around them, and she understood something profound, that life's greatest gifts often arrive disguised as disasters, that the paths we never chose sometimes lead to exactly where we need to be. She had lost a marriage, but gained a son. She had lost a career but found a purpose. She had lost the life she knew but discovered a world she never imagined, and in that world, surrounded by people who loved her, she was finally home.